On a cold February morning in 1957, a patrolman named Elmer Palmer drove through a light drizzle. He was headed toward a remote stretch of Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia. The road was quiet that day, as it usually was in this northeastern corner of the city, where farmland still bordered the growing suburban developments. Fox Chase in 1957 was a place caught between two eras. Brick row houses were beginning to rise on land that had been pastures just a few years before. The old rural character of the area still lingered. Unpaved lanes and stretches of woodland that no one had yet gotten around to clearing. Palmer had received a call about something strange in the woods. Something a college student had spotted near an illegal dumping ground, where residents sometimes abandoned old appliances and unwanted furniture. These dumping sites were common in the transitional areas on the city's edges, places where people would drag old washing machines or broken refrigerators rather than pay to have them hauled away properly. The student had mentioned a box, and possibly a doll inside. It seemed like nothing, probably a discarded toy some child had outgrown. But the call had come in, and Palmer was a thorough officer. He would check it out. He parked his cruiser on Susquehanna Road and made his way through the bare winter brush, past rusted car parts and discarded household debris, until he found what he was looking for. The ground was soft from recent rains, and the February chill cut through his uniform. The sky hung low and gray over the naked trees. It was the kind of morning when the cold seems to seep into everything, when the world itself feels diminished and silent. There is something about the landscape of that discovery that stays with anyone who visits the area. Even now, decades after the open fields have been replaced by suburban homes, the spot where the box was found is near someone's driveway now, an unremarkable stretch of ground that gives no indication of the tragedy that occurred there. But in 1957, it was a lonely place, a dumping ground where people brought things they wanted to disappear, where rusted appliances and broken furniture accumulated among the trees, like the refuse of a civilization that had forgotten how to take care of its own. The choice of that location tells us something about whoever disposed of the boy's body. They knew the area well enough to know it was isolated, that people dumped things there and no one paid much attention. They knew the roads well enough to navigate them in the dark or the early morning hours when no one would see. They chose a spot far from the neighborhoods where the boy had lived, as though distance itself might sever the connection between the child and whatever had happened to him. It was a calculated choice, made by someone who was thinking clearly enough to consider the logistics of disposing of a body, which tells us something about the state of mind of whoever did this. This was not a crime of passion, not a moment of uncontrolled violence followed by panic. This was deliberate, planned, carried out with careful attention to the need for secrecy. It was a large cardboard box, the kind that might hold a piece of nursery furniture. The words on the side indicated it had once contained a bassinet from J.C. Penney. The box sat among the other refuse, as if it belonged there, as if it were just another piece of garbage that someone had discarded. But when Palmer drew close and looked inside, he understood immediately that this was no doll. This was a child, a small boy. His head and narrow shoulders visible above a worn flannel blanket that bore a pattern resembling a Navajo design. The boy was naked beneath that covering, and he was very clearly dead. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that comes after death, and his eyes were closed as though in sleep, though this was no sleep from which he would ever wake. Palmer would later say that the moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. He had young children of his own at home, and something about this discovery cut through whatever professional detachment he might have cultivated in his years on the force. The boy looked to be perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with light brown hair that had been recently and crudely cut close to his scalp. Clumps of that hair still clung to his body, as though whoever had cut it had done so hastily, perhaps after death itself. His small frame showed signs of severe malnourishment, the ribs visible beneath skin that was stretched too tight, the limbs too thin for a child his apparent age. And even in that first terrible moment, Palmer could see the bruises that covered his skin, dark marks that spoke of violence, repeated over time. Palmer stood there in the cold February drizzle, looking down at this discarded child, and felt something shift inside him. He would carry this image for more than 50 years, until his own death in 2011. In interviews given decades later, this was the one that bothered everybody. But that was an understatement. The kind of measured language that people use when the truth is too heavy for ordinary words. He radioed for backup and for the medical examiner. Within hours, the site would be transformed into a crime scene, cordoned off with rope, photographed from every angle, searched by officers who crawled through the underbrush, looking for anything that might explain how this child had come to be here. But in those first minutes, before the machinery of investigation began to turn, alone in the winter woods, the drizzle continued to fall. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed on Susquehanna Road, its driver unaware of what lay just beyond the tree line. The world went on as it always does, indifferent to tragedy, while Palmer waited for help to arrive. This was the beginning of what would become one of the longest and most haunting unsolved cases in Philadelphia history. For 65 years, the identity of this child would remain a mystery, a wound that refused to heal in the consciousness of the city that found him. He would be buried twice, exhumed twice, and become the subject of countless investigative efforts. He would be given many names over the decades. The newspapers called him the boy in the box, a name that captured the horror of how he was found, but reduced him perhaps inevitably to a symbol. Others, seeking something gentler and more dignified, called him America's unknown child, a title that acknowledged the way his story had transcended Philadelphia to become a national mystery. But his true name, the one written on his birth certificate, would not be spoken aloud until December of 2022, when he was finally identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a 4-year-old boy born in Philadelphia on the 13th of January 1953. The story of Joseph Zarelli is not simply a tale of forensic investigation or police procedure, though it is certainly that as well. It is a story about memory and persistence, about the way a community can hold on to a stranger's child and refuse to let him be forgotten, even when every logical reason suggests the case should be closed and set aside. It is about the limits of what we can know about the past, the way evidence degrades and witnesses die and memories fade until the truth seems to recede beyond reach. And it is about the way technology eventually arrives to answer questions that once seemed unanswerable, decades after the people who first asked those questions have gone to their own graves. But more than any of this, the story of Joseph Zarelli is about a little boy whose short life was marked by suffering, whose death was violent and lonely, and whose existence went unacknowledged by anyone who should have cared for him. He was 4 years old when he died. He weighed 30 pounds. He had bruises on his body and surgical scars that spoke of medical procedures someone had arranged for him at some point in his brief life. Someone had cut his hair, perhaps in death. Someone had wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a box and driven to a rural dumping ground and left him there among the rusted appliances and household trash. And then that someone had driven away and said nothing. And Joseph Zarelli had become America's unknown child, a symbol of all the children who suffer in silence, whose lives and deaths go unwitnessed by the world. Anyone who has ever lived in Philadelphia, particularly those who were alive in 1957, will tell you that the boy in the box became something more than a cold case. He became a kind of civic preoccupation, a wound that never quite healed in the collective memory of the city. His face appeared on posters throughout Philadelphia and its suburbs, inserted into gas bills and displayed in store windows and tacked to telephone poles and bulletin boards. Those who saw that image as children carried it with them into adulthood and then into old age, still remembering the face of the unknown boy decades after the posters had yellowed and crumbled away. There is something about an unidentified child that strikes at a very particular kind of fear, something more primal than the ordinary horror of murder. Adults who die anonymously are tragic, but they have at least had the chance to make some mark upon the world, to be known by someone somewhere. A child who dies without a name suggests something darker, the possibility that a human being can be born and suffer and die and simply vanish from the record of existence as though they had never been. It suggests that the systems we trust to protect children can fail completely, that a small boy can be beaten to death and no one will notice because no one knew he existed in the first place. This is the fear that Joseph Zarelli embodied for 65 years. And it is why so many people who had no personal connection to the case to leave flowers for a child they had never known, to hope against hope that someday his name would be discovered. The discovery unfolded in stages. And like so much else about this case, the circumstances were stranger and more complicated than they first appeared. The college student who first spotted the box was a junior at La Salle University named Frederick Bononis, a 27-year-old who lived not far from the site where the body was found. His story would prove more troubling than it initially seemed, not because he was suspected of any involvement in the child's death, but because his hesitation to come forward would become emblematic of all the silence that surrounded this case. Bononis claimed he had been walking through the woods on the 24th of February, 1957, the day before the body was officially discovered, checking rabbit traps he had set in the area. He noticed the cardboard box among the other debris and saw what he thought was a doll or perhaps a mannequin inside. The sight unnerved him, but he convinced himself it was nothing, just a discarded toy, and he went home. He did not call the police. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. It was only the following day, February 25, after hearing a radio report about a missing girl from Belmar, New Jersey, that Bononis began to wonder whether the figure in the box might have been something more than a doll. The missing girl was young, and the description seemed to match what he had glimpsed. He decided to contact authorities. When investigators later pressed him on why he had delayed his report, why he had not called immediately upon seeing something suspicious, a different story emerged. The woods near Susquehanna Road bordered the House of the Good Shepherd, a residential facility for wayward girls, and Bononis eventually admitted that he had been in the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the residents. It was an embarrassing confession, and it explained his initial reluctance to involve the police. He had not wanted to explain what he was doing near the home, had not wanted to draw attention to himself in a way that might raise uncomfortable questions. Investigators were satisfied that Bononis had nothing to do with the child's death. He passed a lie detector test and was never considered a suspect. But his story revealed something troubling about the world in which this crime had occurred. A world where shame and fear of exposure could keep a man silent even when he had seen something that might matter, where the impulse toward self-protection could outweigh the obligation to report what he had found. And there was an even earlier sighting that police did not learn about until weeks later. A high school student named John Powroznik, then 18 years old, had spotted the box a day or two before Benoni's. Powroznik had been walking through the same stretch of woods when he noticed the box and saw something inside it that frightened him badly. Unlike Benoni's, he did not convince himself it was a doll. He knew or suspected that it was something worse. But he too said nothing. He was so startled and scared, investigators later learned that he was afraid to mention it even to his own parents. He simply walked away and tried to forget what he had seen. These multiple sightings meant that the box had likely been in the woods for at least several days before authorities were finally notified. Each day that passed, evidence degraded. Rain fell on the scene, washing away whatever traces the killer might have left. Animals may have disturbed the site. The cold February weather worked its slow changes on the body. By the time police finally arrived, some portion of whatever could have been learned was already lost, erased by time and weather, and the hesitation of young men who saw something terrible and turned away. When the medical examiner's office received the body on the 26th of February 1957, they documented everything they could about the unknown child. With the meticulous care of professionals who understood that every detail might prove crucial, the examination room was cold and bright, and the boy who had been left in the woods like trash was treated with the dignity that he had been denied in death. Laid out on a table and photographed and measured and examined by experts who hoped that his body might tell them the story that no living witness had come forward to share. He was 3 feet 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 30 pounds, significantly underweight for a boy his apparent age. A healthy 4-year-old might weigh 40 pounds or more. This child showed the effects of prolonged malnutrition, his body stunted by insufficient food, or perhaps by illness or some combination of the two. His ribs were visible through his skin. His cheeks were hollow in a way that children's cheeks should never be. His hair, the portions that remained, was light brown and had been cut very recently, possibly within hours of his death. The cutting had been done clumsily with no apparent skill, leaving uneven patches and stray clumps that adhered to his skin, as though whoever had performed the hasty barbering had not bothered to brush away the trimmings. Some investigators theorized this was an attempt to disguise his identity, to change his appearance enough that someone who might have recognized him with longer hair would not recognize him now. Others thought it might have been a practical measure, perhaps done to remove evidence of something that had clung to his hair, though what that might have been no one could say. The boy's body bore the evidence of prolonged abuse, a history of violence that extended far beyond whatever had killed him. Multiple bruises covered his head, face, and body, some fresh enough to have occurred within hours or days of death, others older and in various stages of healing. The yellowish green of bruises that had been there for a week or more. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, a series of impacts that had caused catastrophic damage to his skull and brain. The back of his head had been smashed in, but this was only the final chapter of what was clearly a longer story of suffering. There were older injuries as well, scars that told a story of pain that extended far beyond his final hours. He had an L-shaped scar under his chin, the kind of scar that results from a wound that required stitches or other medical attention. He had surgical scars on his left ankle and in his groin area, marks that suggested medical procedures performed at some point during his short life. One scar in particular caught the attention of investigators. A mark that appeared consistent with an intravenous line, the kind of wound that might result from extended hospitalization. Somewhere at some point, this child had received medical care. Someone had treated him, perhaps saved his life from one crisis, only for him to end up here. His feet and one of his hands appeared wrinkled, pruny in the way skin looks after extended immersion in water. Investigators could not determine whether this had occurred before or after death. If before, it suggested that he had been bathed shortly before dying, or perhaps drowned in a bathtub, though drowning was not the cause of death. If after, it might simply reflect the conditions in which the body had been stored before being dumped. The blanket wrapped around him was a cheap flannel covering with a pattern that some described as resembling a Navajo design, faded as though it had been washed many times. It had been recently laundered, and unlike the box that held him, it seemed well used, ordinary, the kind of thing that might be found in any household. The bassinet box had a serial number that investigators traced to a J.C. Penney store in Upper Darby, about 15 miles from where the body was found. The store had received a shipment of 12 such boxes in late November 1956, shortly before Christmas, and all had been sold by mid-February 1957. The bassinets themselves were white and cost $7.50, a modest price that would have put them within reach of most young families looking to furnish a nursery. Police located 8 of the purchasers, who either still had their boxes or could account for disposing of them through normal means, setting them out with the trash or breaking them down for disposal. The remaining 4 buyers had paid cash, and in the era before computerized records and credit card tracking, cash purchases left no paper trail. There was no way to identify those customers, no way to connect the box to a particular buyer. The lead, which had seemed so promising when investigators first identified the manufacturer and traced the shipment, went nowhere. In those first weeks, Philadelphia police threw everything they had at the case. Commissioner Thomas J. Gibbons authorized the citywide distribution of posters showing the boy's face, and the Philadelphia Inquirer printed 4,000,000 flyers as a public service, donating the printing costs in what the paper called an unprecedented effort to identify an unknown victim. These flyers were posted in train stations, grocery stores, drugstores, and public buildings throughout the Delaware Valley region. They appeared in store windows and on community bulletin boards and telephone poles. Most remarkably, and perhaps most effectively, copies of the flyer were inserted into every gas bill in Philadelphia, placing the boy's image directly into hundreds of thousands of homes, reaching people who might never have stopped to read a poster on the street, but who would certainly open their utility bill. The flyer included 3 photographs of the boy, taken by police photographers who had tried to arrange him in a way that approximated how he might have looked in life. In one image, he was dressed in clothing and positioned upright, as though he were simply a child sitting for a portrait, rather than a murdered boy whose photograph was being circulated in the hope that someone would recognize him. There was a photograph of the blanket as well, its distinctive pattern reproduced in grainy black and white. The flyer described the boy's physical characteristics, his height and weight, and approximate age, and it listed the items found near his body: the bassinet box from J.C. Penney, the blue corduroy cap, the white handkerchief with the letter G embroidered in the corner, and it made a plea, a request that citizens and law enforcement agencies provide any information they might have about boys matching this description, who might have been in the custody of persons who would abuse them. The response was overwhelming in volume but frustrating in substance. Hundreds of tips poured in from Philadelphia and beyond, from concerned citizens who thought they might have seen a boy matching the description, from people who remembered a neighbor or relative with a child who had disappeared or died under unexplained circumstances. By April 1957, more than 50 people from outside the city and 85 local residents had come forward, claiming to be able to identify the boy. Police received 500 letters related to the case, some from as far away as California and Texas, from people who had seen the story in national news coverage and thought they might have information that could help. Each lead was followed, each possibility investigated, and each time the trail went cold. The tips led to foster homes and orphanages and private households, to families with children who roughly matched the description. And in every case, the children in question were either accounted for or clearly not the boy in the box. There is something almost unbearable about imagining the effort that went into this search. The hours upon hours of work by detectives who refused to give up, who believed that the next lead might be the one that broke the case open. 270 police academy recruits were dispatched to comb the crime scene in the days after the discovery. Young men in training who crawled through the underbrush on their hands and knees, searching for anything that might have been overlooked in the initial examination. They found 3 items that might have been relevant: a man's blue corduroy cap, a child's scarf, and a man's white handkerchief with the letter G embroidered in one corner. The cap received particular attention. It was an Ivy League style, in royal blue, corduroy size 7 1/8. In excellent condition despite being found in the woods. Most significantly, it bore a manufacturer's stamp in the lining that read Robin's Bald Eagle Cap, followed by an address on South 7th Street in Philadelphia. The shop was small, and when investigators visited the owner, Hannah Robbins, she remembered making the cap because the buyer had requested a special customization: a leather strap and buckle be added to the band. She described him as a blond man between 26 and 30 years old, but she had no name, no address, no way to trace him. Like so much else in this case, the clue illuminated nothing. The cap might have belonged to the killer, or it might have been discarded by someone entirely unconnected to the crime, dropped in the woods weeks or months before the boy's body was left there. The blanket received equal attention from investigators. The Philadelphia Textile Institute examined it and traced its manufacture to either Granby, Quebec, or Swannanoa, North Carolina. The pattern was distinctive enough to suggest a limited number of sources, and for a time, investigators hoped they might be able to trace its sale the way they had traced the bassinet box. But thousands of identical blankets had been produced and sold throughout the country. There was no serial number, no identifying mark, no way to determine where this particular blanket had been purchased or by whom. It was the kind of inexpensive household item that could be found in any department store in America, and its presence at the crime scene told investigators nothing they could use. In the weeks and months that followed, the discovery investigators pursued every conceivable angle. They contacted the American Medical Association, sending out descriptions of the surgical scars on the boy's body in the hope that a doctor somewhere might recognize the distinctive marks and be able to identify a former patient. They checked records of missing children throughout the eastern seaboard, comparing physical descriptions with the details they had recorded during the autopsy. They looked into adoption agencies and orphanages and foster homes, anywhere that a child might have been placed, without leaving a paper trail that would make him easy to identify. They investigated rumors and followed up on false confessions from troubled individuals who claimed responsibility for the murder but could not provide details that would confirm their stories. Nothing led them to the boy's identity. One lead seemed promising for a time. A 2-year-old boy named Stephen Craig Damman had been abducted from a grocery store in East Meadow, New York, in October 1955, just over a year before the boy in the box was found. The physical descriptions were similar enough that some investigators wondered whether the two cases might be connected, whether the unknown boy in Philadelphia might be the missing child from Long Island. But when they examined the evidence more closely, Damon had broken his arm before his disappearance, and the boy in the box showed no evidence of such a fracture. Their footprints did not match. In 2003, DNA testing would definitively confirm that the boy in the box was not Stephen Damon. But by then, investigators had already moved on from that theory decades earlier. The failure to identify the boy became something more than a cold case. It became a wound in the city's consciousness, a reminder of how completely the systems designed to protect children could fail. Philadelphia in 1957 was a city of neighborhoods, of communities where people knew their neighbors and looked out for one another. The discovery of this unknown child, beaten and discarded like garbage, challenged the image the city had of itself. How could this happen here? How could a child suffer and die without anyone noticing? These were questions that haunted not just the investigators assigned to the case, but ordinary citizens who had nothing to do with law enforcement. People who simply could not accept that such a thing was possible in their city. Bill Fleischer, who would later become one of the founders of the Vidocq Society, was 13 years old in 1957 and lived in Philadelphia. He remembers seeing the poster of the unknown boy in a Penn fruit grocery store on City Avenue. The child's face staring out from the flyer, and being literally stunned by what he saw. It could be you, he thought. It could be your brother. The image stayed with him for the rest of his life. And decades later, when he was in a position to do something about it, he made the boy in the box one of the Vidocq Society's priority cases. He was not alone. Tom Augustine, the detective who would later lead the reopened investigation, was 11 years old in 1957. He too saw the poster and was deeply affected by it. "It was very heartbreaking for me as a kid," he said later. "There was something about that face, about the vulnerability and the tragedy it represented, that seared itself into the memories of everyone who saw it." In the months after the investigation stalled, life in Philadelphia went on. The city had other crimes to solve, other tragedies to address, other demands on the attention of its police force. But the boy in the box did not disappear from public consciousness. His story resurfaced periodically in newspaper articles and television reports, each anniversary of his discovery bringing renewed attention and renewed appeals for information. Strangers continued to visit his grave, leaving flowers and toys, tending the plot that held a child no one could name. There was something almost sacred about this attention, something that spoke to a deep human need to acknowledge the dead, to insist that even those who died nameless and forgotten deserved to be remembered. By July 1957, 5 months after the discovery, every lead had been followed, every tip investigated, and police were no closer to identifying the boy than they had been on the day his body was found. His remains had lain in the city morgue all that time, while detectives hoped someone would come forward to claim him. Some grieving family member who could tell them who he was and what had happened to him. No one did. The silence was as complete as it was heartbreaking. Whoever this child was, no one in the world seemed to be looking for him. No parents had filed a missing persons report. No relatives had come forward. No neighbors or teachers or doctors had called to say they recognized the face on those 40000 flyers. On the 24th of July, 1957, a small funeral was held in a chapel in northeast Philadelphia. The mourners were not family members or friends, but the detectives and medical examiner's staff who had worked the case. Men who had grown haunted by the image of the unknown boy and who had taken up a collection to pay for a proper burial. It was a modest affair, befitting a child who had no one to mourn him in the traditional way. But it was conducted with dignity. Prayers were said. Words were spoken over the small coffin. The boy was buried in a potter's field in the Holmesburg section of Philadelphia, a cemetery for executed prisoners, unidentified bodies and body parts. A place where the city laid to rest those who had no one to bury them anywhere else. His headstone, paid for by the investigators who had been unable to give him his name, bore the inscription, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." It was a prayer and an acknowledgement of failure, a recognition that the people who should have been able to identify this child had done their best and come up short. The gravesite was on Comley Road, in a corner of the cemetery that received little attention from anyone who did not live nearby. But in the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Residents of the surrounding neighborhood began to care for the grave, leaving flowers and small toys for the unknown boy who lay beneath the simple marker. They did not know who he was. They had no personal connection to his case, but something about his story touched them, and they refused to let his grave fall into neglect. The plot, with its modest headstone, became a place of pilgrimage for people who had never met the child, but who felt somehow that he was their responsibility now. This spontaneous adoption of the unknown boy by strangers who had nothing to gain from caring for him speaks to something deep in human nature, some instinct that rebels against the idea of a child dying alone and unloved. Perhaps people saw in him a symbol of their own children, their own grandchildren, their own vulnerability in a world that can be cruel beyond comprehension. Perhaps they simply could not accept that a child could be so thoroughly abandoned even in death. And their care for his grave was a way of protesting against that abandonment, of insisting that he mattered, even if no one else would say so. Over the years, the site took on an almost sacred character. People would drive out of their way to visit, to lay flowers beside the headstone, to say a prayer for a child they had never known. Teachers brought classes of school children to the grave as part of lessons about compassion and responsibility. Police officers who had worked the case made regular pilgrimages, standing in silence before the marker, lost in thoughts about the questions they had never been able to answer. The grave became a destination for victims' rights advocates and missing persons investigators, a reminder of why their work mattered, of what was at stake when a child disappeared and no one seemed to notice. There is a relatable experience that many people have had, standing before the grave of someone they did not know in life, but whose story has somehow touched them. It might be a soldier's grave in a military cemetery, or the marker for a person who died in some historic disaster, or the final resting place of someone whose tragedy became public knowledge. In those moments, standing before a stranger's grave, something shifts in our understanding of what it means to be connected to other human beings. We are reminded that every grave contains a story, that every person who ever lived deserved to be remembered, that the act of remembering is itself a kind of sacred obligation. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches to unsolved cases, a weight that some investigators carry for the rest of their lives, a burden that grows heavier rather than lighter as the years pass and the answers remain out of reach. The boy in the box became something of an obsession for many who worked on it, a case that would not let them go even after they had moved on to other investigations, other tragedies. But no investigator embodied this more fully than Remington Bristow, an employee of the medical examiner's office who had been present when the body was first examined, and who would spend the next 36 years pursuing answers that always seemed just out of reach. Bristow was a man who had spent his career surrounded by death. He came from a family in the funeral industry, had worked at several funeral homes before joining the medical examiner's office in Philadelphia after moving to the city in 1952. He had what his grandson later called a lot of respect for the dead, a belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, even in death, even when no one else was left to care. The idea of an unmarked grave, a child buried without a name, bothered him in a way that went beyond professional concern. It became personal in a way that surprised even him. In the years after the boy was buried, Bristow kept working the case on his own time. He followed up on leads that the official investigation had abandoned. He knocked on doors throughout the Philadelphia region, interviewing anyone who might have information, pursuing any theory that seemed even remotely plausible. He spent thousands of his own dollars on the investigation, money that his family could not easily spare. He told reporters that he literally wore out the soles of his shoes following up on tips. And this was not an exaggeration. He carried the boy's plastered death mask with him in a briefcase wherever he went, ready to show it to anyone who might be able to help. A gruesome talisman of the case that consumed him. He referred to the boy as "my boy," a phrase that hinted at the depth of his emotional involvement. Bristow's approach was unorthodox, to say the least. In 1960, frustrated by the lack of progress through conventional means, he consulted a psychic in New Jersey. This was not the kind of lead that would hold up in a court of law, not the kind of evidence that police departments typically rely upon. But Bristow was desperate. The psychic told him to look for a house that matched the image she was receiving, a foster home of some kind, an older building that had been converted to house children. When Bristow brought her to the area where the body had been found, she led him directly to a large house about 1.5 miles from the discovery site. A home that had operated as a foster care facility run by a man named Arthur Nicoletti. At an estate sale at the property, Bristow noticed a bassinet similar to those sold by J.C. Penney, and blankets on the clothesline that bore a striking resemblance to the one found wrapped around the boy. Bristow became convinced that he had found the answer. He believed the boy was the child of the stepdaughter of the man who ran the foster home, a young woman said to have been mentally challenged and to have had several children out of wedlock. In Bristow's theory, the boy's death might have been accidental, and the family had disposed of the body to avoid exposing the stepdaughter's situation. He spent years developing this theory, interviewing neighbors and gathering circumstantial evidence. But Philadelphia police investigated the lead thoroughly and concluded it was a dead end. All the foster children were accounted for, and there was no evidence linking the family to the unknown boy. In 1998, when the case was reopened, investigators interviewed the foster father and his stepdaughter, whom he had by then married. DNA testing eventually confirmed that the stepdaughter was not the boy's mother. The foster home theory was closed. Bristow died in 1993. 5 years before that DNA test would disprove his theory, and nearly 30 years before the boy would finally be identified. He never knew that he had been wrong, that the answer he had been so certain of was not the answer after all. He went to his grave, believing he knew who the boy in the box was, still carrying the weight of a case he could never quite solve. His grandson later said that Bristow would sometimes tell reporters he did not believe the case was a homicide, that perhaps the boy's parents had loved him, and his death had been an accident they could not afford to report. But his grandson believed this was a strategy, a lure meant to coax the real parents into coming forward by assuring them they would not be blamed. It never worked. The silence continued unbroken. year after year. There were others like Bristow, men who could not walk away from this case. William Kelly, who had been a fingerprint expert in 1957 and was one of the first investigators on the scene, continued working on it for decades. He checked the footprints of infants at area hospitals, sorting through thousands of records from 1,951 through 1,953, wondering if any of the poorly taken prints might have belonged to the unknown boy. Joseph McGillen, who had worked in the medical examiner's office when the body was discovered, remained involved in the case well into his 80s. Sam Weinstein, the second officer to arrive at the scene after Palmer worked on the case through the Vidocq Society until his death in 2004. These men passed the case from one to another like a torch, each hoping that he would be the one to finally find the answer, each ultimately failing and passing the burden to the next generation. Anyone who spends time with this case will eventually confront the question of why no one claimed this child. Why did no family member step forward? Why was there no missing persons report, no frantic search by loved ones? The most disturbing possibility is that the people who should have cared for Joseph Zarelli were the same people responsible for his suffering and death. A child so thoroughly erased from the record of the world is almost certainly a child who was not wanted, or whose existence was inconvenient to those who had power over him. It is difficult not to imagine what Joseph's life might have been like in the years before his death. He was born in January 1953, in the early months of the Eisenhower administration, when America was prosperous and optimistic, and the baby boom was in full swing. He should have had a normal childhood, should have learned to walk and talk and run and play, should have gone to school and made friends and done all the things that children do. Instead, by the time he was 4 years old, his body showed the marks of prolonged malnutrition and repeated abuse. The surgical scars on his ankle and groin suggested medical procedures that someone had arranged for him, which meant that at some point there were doctors who examined him, nurses who cared for him, adults who knew he existed. What happened to those connections? Why did no medical professional come forward when his face appeared on 400,000 flyers throughout Philadelphia? The answer may be that Joseph existed in a shadow world, a space outside the normal systems of record-keeping and accountability that most children inhabit. He was never issued a Social Security number. There is no evidence that he ever attended school or was registered with any child care facility. His birth certificate existed, but apparently no one connected that document to the murdered child, whose face stared out from posters across the city. In 1957, before computerized databases and digital records, it was possible for a child to slip through the cracks in ways that would be much more difficult today. But the completeness of Joseph's erasure suggests something more deliberate than bureaucratic failure. Someone made sure this child would not be found. Someone ensured that when his body was discovered, there would be no trail leading back to them. Anyone who has lived in a small town knows how silence can spread, how an entire community can decide not to see what is happening in a neighbor's house, how the sounds of violence can be explained away or ignored, how children can suffer in plain sight, while adults convince themselves it is not their business to intervene. But Philadelphia in 1957 was not a small town. It was a major American city, and Joseph lived in its West Philadelphia neighborhoods, surrounded by thousands of people who might have noticed if a child had disappeared or was being mistreated. The silence that surrounded him was not the silence of isolation, but the silence of complicity, the silence of people who knew or suspected and said nothing. Some people asked themselves why the investigation was not more aggressive, why police did not pursue certain leads more thoroughly. why certain connections were not made sooner. But this criticism misses the fundamental challenge that confronted investigators from the very beginning. How do you identify a child when no one is looking for him? How do you solve a murder when no one will admit the victim ever existed? The investigators who worked on this case were not incompetent or lazy. They were dedicated professionals who pursued every lead, followed every tip, knocked on thousands of doors, and still came up empty. The failure was not theirs. The failure belonged to whoever had raised this child in secret and disposed of his body in silence, leaving no trace for investigators to follow. The decades passed. New detectives inherited the case, and each generation brought fresh eyes and new technologies. In 1998, the Philadelphia Police Department, working with the Vidocq Society, obtained a court order to exhume the boy's remains. The Vidocq Society was a Philadelphia-based organization founded in 1990, named after the 19th-century French criminal who became a pioneering detective. Its members included retired law enforcement professionals, forensic experts, and others who had dedicated their careers to solving crimes. They specialized in cold cases, the ones that other agencies had given up on, and they had adopted The Boy in the Box as one of their signature investigations. The exhumation was conducted in November 1998, more than 40 years after the boy had first been buried. Forensic scientists extracted DNA from enamel on one of his teeth, hoping that advances in genetic testing might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for so long. The technology of 1998 was far more sophisticated than anything available in 1957, but it was still limited compared to what would come later. The DNA sample was obtained successfully, but there was no database to compare it to. No way to identify whose genetic material they had recovered. They had the boy's DNA, but without a family member to match it against, the information was useless. The reburial that followed the exhumation became a kind of civic memorial, an outpouring of emotion from a city that had never forgotten this unknown child. On the 11th of November 1998, a clear day after clouds and rain had passed through, the boy was interred at Ivy Hill Cemetery in the Cedar Brook section of Philadelphia. The Ivy Hill Cemetery had donated a large plot near the entrance, a place of honor where visitors would see his grave as soon as they entered. The coffin, headstone, and funeral service were all donated by the son of the man who had first buried the boy in 1957, a gesture that connected the two burials across 4 decades. More than 100 people attended the ceremony, far more than had been present at the first quiet funeral in 1957. There were detectives who had worked the case over the years, some of them now elderly men who had been young officers when the body was first found. There were members of the Vidocq Society who had taken ownership of the investigation and vowed to see it through. And there were ordinary citizens, people who had no professional connection to the case, but who felt for reasons they might not have been able to articulate that they needed to be there. Some brought flowers. A school bus driver from Boyertown named Rita O'Very clutched a bouquet of blue carnations that she said was from the children who rode her bus. "I was 10 when it happened," she told a reporter. "My job revolves around children, and I never forgot him. The poor little guy." An African Methodist Episcopal minister, a Catholic priest, and a rabbi offered prayers, representing the religious diversity of a city that had embraced this child as its own. A lone bagpiper played "Going Home," the melody drifting over the cemetery in the autumn air. Detective Sam Weinstein, who had been the second officer on the scene back in 1957, the Jewish prayer for the dead, his voice breaking at times. When he finished, he walked to his seat and embraced Tom Augustine. the detective who had led the reopened investigation. Two men bound together by a case that had shaped their careers and their lives. Today we are reinterring him and calling him America's unknown child as a symbol of our nation's abused children, missing children, and murdered children, said William Fleischer, head of the Vidocq Society. We are validating this little boy's life. Our mission is to go forward from this day and put a name on that tombstone. The new headstone was large and made of black serpentine stone, engraved with a lamb, a symbol of innocence. It read simply, America's unknown child. A year later, the Vidocq Society placed a small granite bench near the grave where visitors could sit. The grave became a destination for people from across the region and beyond, a place where the bereaved came to grieve not only for this particular child, but for all the children who had suffered as he had. Strangers left flowers and stuffed animals. Someone always seemed to be tending the plot. City residents keep the grave decorated with flowers and toys, the newspapers reported. As though the entire city had adopted this child, who had been discarded by those who should have loved him. The story aired on America's Most Wanted shortly after the reburial, generating hundreds of new tips. Detectives followed up on every lead, hoping that the national exposure might finally produce the breakthrough they had been seeking. But the tips led nowhere. The DNA sample extracted from the boy's tooth was too degraded to produce useful results with the technology available at the time. Once again, the case went cold, and the investigators were left with their frustration and their determination to keep trying. The most dramatic lead came in 2002, when a woman identified only as M or Martha came forward with a shocking story that would captivate investigators and divide them for years to come. M was a woman living in Ohio, middle-aged and troubled, who had been in and out of psychiatric care for much of her adult life. She had been working with a psychiatrist who encouraged her to confront difficult memories from her past. And what she revealed was almost too terrible to contemplate. M claimed that her late mother had purchased the boy from his birth parents in the summer of 1954, when he was approximately 2 years old. She said the boy's name was Jonathan, and that he had lived in her family's home in the Philadelphia suburbs for the next 2.5 years, during which time he was subjected to extreme physical and sexual abuse by M's mother. According to M, her mother had beaten the boy to death in a fit of rage after he vomited in the bathtub. The mother, furious at having to clean up the mess, had slammed the child against the floor with fatal force. M claimed to have been present during the aftermath, watching as her mother cut the boy's long hair after death to change his appearance and make him harder to identify. She said she accompanied her mother when she drove to Fox Chase to dispose of the body, helping to wrap him in a blanket and place him in the cardboard box. M provided one detail that seemed particularly compelling, a piece of information that made investigators sit up and take notice. She said that as they were preparing to remove the boy from the car trunk at the dumping site, a male motorist had pulled alongside and offered assistance. Thinking something was wrong, the Good Samaritan had stopped to ask if the two women needed help. M's mother ignored him, she said, while being careful to shield their car's license plate from his view. The man eventually drove away, apparently convinced that nothing was seriously amiss. This detail matched confidential testimony given by a witness in 1957, a man who had reported seeing two women with a car at the location around the time the body was believed to have been dumped. That information had never been made public. There was no way M could have learned it from newspaper coverage of the case. Investigators from the Vidocq Society traveled to Ohio, where M was living, to interview her and her psychiatrist. Her story had remained consistent over more than a decade of therapy, and many of the details she provided checked out with known facts about the case. The psychiatrist believed she was telling the truth. Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society said he was convinced, estimating the odds that she was lying at 8,000 to 1. She has given enough detail to make the story credible, Fleischer told reporters, to increase the probability so that it is not completely coincidental. But there were problems with M's account. Problems that prevented investigators from closing the case based on her testimony alone. She had a documented history of mental illness, including hospitalizations and intensive psychiatric treatment, which made her a problematic witness in any legal sense. Her memories, however vivid and consistent, might have been influenced by her psychological condition. Neighbors who had lived near her family during the stated time period denied that any young boy had ever been present in the household, and dismissed her claims as ridiculous. Many of the details she provided, apart from the Good Samaritan incident, were matters of public record that she could theoretically have learned from newspaper coverage or other sources. Most frustrating of all, M was not a blood relative of the boy, which meant DNA testing could not confirm or deny her claims. Her mother, whom she accused of the murder, was long dead. There was no way to interrogate the alleged killer, no way to search for physical evidence that might have survived in the family home. And then, M stopped cooperating. When investigators pressed her for more information for details that might help them verify her story, she withdrew. Her real name was eventually leaked to the media, destroying whatever anonymity she had hoped to preserve. And she reportedly left the country. The lead that had seemed so promising, the testimony that had convinced some of the most experienced investigators in the country. The case remained officially unsolved, but M's account lingered in the minds of those who had heard it. For some investigators, it represented the most plausible explanation for what had happened to the boy, a theory that fit the evidence better than any other. For others, it was simply another dead end, another theory that could be neither proved nor disproved, another frustration in a case that seemed designed to frustrate. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. The years continued to pass. New generations grew up knowing the boy in the box only as a story their parents had told them, a legend of old Philadelphia that seemed almost too terrible to be true. The investigators who had worked the case in 1957 grew old and died one by one, each of them carrying their memories of the unknown child to their own graves. Elmer Palmer, the first officer on the scene, died in 2011, still hoping the boy would someday be identified. Sam Weinstein, who had recited Kaddish at the 1998 reburial, died in 2004. Remington Bristow had died in 1993, never knowing that his foster home theory would eventually be disproved by DNA evidence. William Kelly, the fingerprint expert, who had checked thousands of infant footprints, hoping to find a match, continued working on the case into his 80s. Never giving up hope, the Vidocq Society continued to work the case, bringing new technologies to bear as they became available, reaching out to the public through news stories and television programs, maintaining a constant presence that kept the boy in the box from fading entirely from public memory. They placed an urgent appeal on their website, asking anyone who might remember a young boy named Jonathan, living in or within 40 miles of Philadelphia in the early 1950s to come forward. They sought information from current or retired physicians who might have treated such a boy for conditions that would have left scars on his groin or ankles. They refused to let the case die, even as the passage of time made a solution seem increasingly impossible. Some things about the city had changed dramatically since 1957. The woods where the boy was found had been cleared and developed. replaced by brick row houses and paved streets. The J.C. Penney store, where the bassinet box was purchased, had closed years ago. The Good Shepherd Home for Wayward Girls, where Frederick Benoni's had been hoping to catch a glimpse of the residents, had long since shut its doors. But other things remained remarkably constant. The grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery was still tended by strangers. The case files were still maintained by the Philadelphia Police Department. The question of who the boy was and what had happened to him still lingered in the city's collective memory, a wound that refused to heal no matter how many years passed. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was the product of technologies that had not existed when the boy was first found, technologies that no one in 1957 could have imagined. In 2019, investigators obtained another court order to exhume the remains a second time. The first exhumation in 1998 had yielded a DNA sample, but the technology of that era had not been able to make use of it. Now, 20 years later, the field of genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case work in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The technique which had helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018 and had since been used to solve dozens of other long-dormant cases involves extracting DNA from remains, uploading the results to public genealogical databases, and using the matches to build out family trees until investigators can identify the unknown individual. It does not require finding a direct match. Instead, it works by identifying distant relatives, cousins and second cousins, and even more distant connections who have submitted their own DNA to databases like GDMatch or Ancestry.com. Once enough relatives are identified, genetic genealogists can construct a family tree and determine where the unknown person fits within it. The work was painstaking and required patience that would have been unimaginable in the early days of the investigation. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International, the forensic genealogist who led the analysis, later described the challenge in terms that conveyed both the difficulty and the ingenuity of the process. The boy's DNA was like confetti, she said. After 65 years in the ground, there were only small degraded fragments to work with. Unlike a fresh sample that might yield long intact strands of genetic material, this DNA had been broken down by time and the elements into tiny pieces that were difficult to analyze. But the technique does not require a perfect sample. It works by finding genetic relatives who have uploaded their own DNA to databases for genealogical research, then triangulating the relationships until the unknown person's place in the family tree becomes clear. It is like a giant Sudoku puzzle, Fitzpatrick explained. You get a list of matches, and you move them around, and finally you get a consistent picture of who is related to whom. And the one spot that is missing is the one person you are trying to identify. The first significant match came from a second cousin once removed of the boy, a man named Justin Thomas, who had submitted his DNA to an ancestry database as a hobby. Thomas had been curious about his family history and had uploaded his genetic profile without any thought that it might connect him to an unsolved murder from decades before his birth. When a forensic genealogist contacted him and asked for help with a cold case, he was stunned but willing to assist. Thomas persuaded his mother, who was a first cousin of the boy, to provide a sample as well. The matches confirmed they were on the right track, establishing a clear genetic connection on the maternal side of the family. From there, investigators obtained court orders to access birth records. They examined documentation of children born to the woman they believed was the mother, narrowing the possibilities based on dates and names. They found a birth certificate dated the 13th of January 1953, recording the birth of a boy in Philadelphia. The certificate bore the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli. After 65 years, America's unknown child had a name. On the 8th of December 2022, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw held a press conference at police headquarters to announce that America's unknown child finally had a name. The room was crowded with journalists, police officials, forensic scientists, and members of the Vidocq Society who had worked on the case for decades. For 65 years, the story of who would come to be known as America's unknown child has haunted this community. Commissioner Outlaw said, "The Philadelphia Police Department, our nation, and the world. When people think about the boy in the box, a profound sadness is felt, not just because a child was murdered, but because his entire identity and his rightful claim to own his existence was taken away." Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been born in Philadelphia 69 years earlier, almost to the day. He had lived somewhere near 61st and Market Streets in West Philadelphia, about 15 miles from where his body was found. He had siblings, both maternal and paternal, some of whom were still alive and had been contacted by police before the announcement. His biological parents were both deceased. Police declined to name them publicly, citing respect for the surviving family members who had been blindsided by the news. Captain Jason Smith, of the Philadelphia Homicide Division, acknowledged what everyone already knew. Identifying the boy was only the beginning. The real question, the question that had haunted investigators for 6 decades, was who had killed him and why. "We have our suspicions as to who may be responsible," Smith said. "But it would be irresponsible of me to share these suspicions, as this remains an active and ongoing criminal investigation." He acknowledged that solving the murder would be an uphill battle. If this technology had been available 20 years earlier, because once you identify who the child is, you start interviewing family members. But too much time had passed. Too many potential witnesses were dead. Too many memories had faded beyond recovery. The announcement sent reporters scrambling to piece together what they could about Joseph's family and background. Within days, the Philadelphia Inquirer had identified both of Joseph's parents, though police had declined to name them officially. The journalism that followed the announcement was painstaking and sensitive, acknowledging that many of Joseph's relatives had been blindsided by the news and had no involvement in or knowledge of what had happened to him more than 6 decades earlier. There is something profoundly disorienting about learning that your family is connected to a famous crime, particularly when that connection was completely unknown to you. Joseph's surviving relatives found themselves thrust into a national story they had never asked to be part of, forced to answer questions about ancestors they barely remembered or had never known. Some of them cooperated with investigators and journalists, hoping that their assistance might help solve the case once and for all. Others withdrew, overwhelmed by the attention and the implications of what the DNA evidence had revealed. The Zarelli family in particular found themselves in an impossible position. Their surname was uncommon enough in Philadelphia that once Joseph's identity was announced, anyone who knew the family could make the connection. An attorney representing some of Gus Zarelli's descendants released a statement emphasizing that there was no evidence linking Gus or any member of his immediate family to Joseph's death, and noting that it was unclear whether Gus had even known about Joseph's existence. The circumstances of Joseph's conception and birth remain murky, and it is possible that his father never knew he had fathered a child with Betsy Abel. The stigma of illegitimacy in the 1,950 seconds was severe, and unwed mothers often went to great lengths to conceal their pregnancies and the children that resulted from them. But these questions, however important they might be to the living family members, are ultimately secondary to the central mystery of the case. Someone beat Joseph Zarelli to death. Someone wrapped his body in a blanket and placed it in a cardboard box. Someone drove to a rural dumping ground outside the city and left him there among the trash and debris. These are not abstract questions about family dynamics or social stigma. These are questions about murder, about the intentional killing of a 4-year-old child, and they remain unanswered. The identification, nevertheless, brought a measure of closure that had seemed impossible for so long. On the 13th of January 2023, what would have been Joseph's 70th birthday, a new memorial containing his name and image was unveiled at Ivy Hill Cemetery. Workers at the cemetery, who had tended his grave for decades, were in tears when they finally learned whose grave they had been caring for. To have a name on that stone, one of them said, "That's what everybody has been wishing for forever." The headstone that had read America's unknown child for a quarter century was updated to include Joseph's name, his birth date, and a photograph of his face. No longer the face of an anonymous victim, but the face of a boy with a name and a history. In the weeks following the announcement, reporters pieced together more of Joseph's story, interviewing family members and reviewing documents that had been sealed for decades. His mother, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer's investigation, was a woman named Mary Elizabeth Abel, called Betsy by those who knew her. She had grown up in the Tioga neighborhood of Philadelphia. A real beauty, according to family members who liked skating and dancing and listening to Frank Sinatra records. She came from a family of 5 sisters, all of them raised in the working-class neighborhoods of post-war Philadelphia. His father was Augustus Zarelli, known as Gus, a concrete and stone mason from a proud family of Italian immigrants in West Philadelphia. The Zarelli family had deep roots in the neighborhood, around 61st and Market, where they worked in construction, and attended St. Donato Parish. They had conceived Joseph in the spring of 1952 when Betsy was 21 years old. Gus was a married man. And what happened between them? What led to Joseph's birth and his eventual fate remains shrouded in mystery. Beyond these bare facts, Joseph's life remains largely unknown, a blank space in the historical record where there should have been a childhood filled with school and friends and birthday parties and all the ordinary milestones of growing up. He was never reported missing. He apparently never had a social security number, that fundamental marker of identity in 20th century America. Whatever happened to him between his birth in January 1953 and his death in February 1957 remains a mystery that may never be solved. His surviving relatives told reporters they had no idea they were connected to the case until police contacted them shortly before the announcement. They had never known Joseph existed. They had never heard his name spoken in family gatherings or whispered about in family secrets. He had been erased so completely that even his closest relatives did not know he had ever lived. The question of why remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Why was this child apparently invisible to the systems that should have tracked his existence? Why did no one report him missing when he disappeared? Why did his body end up in a cardboard box on an illegal dumping ground 15 miles from where he had lived? The distance itself is telling. A piece of geography that suggests deliberate planning by whoever disposed of the body. Captain Smith noted that Fox Chase was quite rural in 1957, far from the working-class neighborhoods of West Philadelphia, where Joseph had apparently spent his short life. Whoever disposed of Joseph's body chose a location far from home, a place where the connection would not be obvious, where no neighbor or acquaintance would recognize the blanket or the box or the face of the child inside. The case remains officially open. Philadelphia police continue to investigate. Though the likelihood of criminal charges grows smaller with each passing year, Joseph's biological parents are dead. And while investigators have their suspicions about who was responsible for his death, the standard of proof required for prosecution is high. There may never be a trial, never be a formal accounting of what happened to this child. The secrets that could explain his suffering and death may have died with the people who kept them, carried to their graves by those who knew the truth and chose never to speak it. And yet something has been restored that cannot be taken away. For 65 years, Joseph Augustus Zarelli existed only as an absence, a hole in the fabric of the world where a child should have been. He was the boy without a name, the symbol of all the children who suffer in silence, whose lives and deaths go unacknowledged by the world that should have protected them. Now he has been returned to history. His name is carved in stone. His story, incomplete as it remains, has been told. He is no longer anonymous, no longer forgotten, no longer just a symbol. He is Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born the 13th of January 1953, died February 1957. A child who lived and suffered and deserved better than what the world gave him. The implications of Joseph's identification extend beyond this single case. The techniques that finally gave him his name have the potential to solve countless other mysteries, to identify countless other unidentified remains that have waited years or decades for someone to claim them. Across the country, there are bodies buried in potter's fields and morgue drawers filled with remains that no one has ever been able to identify. There are cold cases that have gone unsolved for generations. Cases where the victim's identity is the first and most fundamental question that investigators cannot answer. The success in the Zarelli case has demonstrated that even the most degraded DNA, even samples that seemed hopelessly contaminated by time, and the elements can yield useful information in the right hands. Commissioner Outlaw at the December 2022 press conference announced that the Philadelphia Police Department would apply the same genetic genealogy techniques to other unidentified remains in their custody. The boy in the box was the city's oldest and most famous cold case. But he was not the only unidentified victim in Philadelphia's files. If the same methods could work for him, they might work for others as well. The announcement was a recognition that a new era had dawned in cold case investigation, an era in which the passage of time need not mean that cases must remain forever unsolved. But there is also something bittersweet about this technological triumph. The identification of Joseph Zarelli came too late for most of the people who had devoted their lives to solving the case. Remington Bristow died in 1993, still believing he knew the answer, never knowing that DNA would eventually prove him wrong. Sam Weinstein died in 2004, having recited Kaddish over the boy's grave without knowing whose soul he was praying for. Elmer Palmer died in 2011, carrying to his grave the memory of that cold February morning when he first looked into the box and saw a dead child staring back at him. William Kelly, Joseph McGillen, Tom Augustine, and countless other investigators who gave years of their lives to this case have passed away without ever learning Joseph's name. The answer they sought so desperately came in the end too late for them to hear it. The grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery is tended by strangers who never knew him, people who feel connected to this child for reasons they might not be able to fully explain. They leave flowers and toys, small gestures of remembrance for a child who was forgotten by those who should have loved him. The cemetery workers who care for the plot do so with particular attention, making sure the grave is always neat, always honored, always remembered. Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society, who had worked on the case for decades and had grown old, pursuing answers that seemed perpetually out of reach, spoke at the press conference, announcing Joseph's identification. He mentioned all the investigators who had devoted themselves to the case and died without seeing it solved. Remington Bristow and Sam Weinstein and William Kelly and so many others who had carried this burden year after year, decade after decade. He said he felt their presence in the room, the ghosts of all those men who had refused to give up on this unknown child. Joseph Augustus Zarelli will no longer be that boy in the box, Fleischer said, his voice thick with emotion after so many years, and will no longer be unknown. There are those who believe that identifying the dead is a kind of sacred work, that every human being deserves to be known by name, to have their existence acknowledged by the world they lived in, however briefly. For Joseph, that acknowledgement came 65 years too late to save him, too late to prevent his suffering, too late to bring his killers to justice, but perhaps not too late to matter in some deeper sense. His case has shown what is possible when a community refuses to forget, when investigators pass their determination from one generation to the next like a sacred trust, when technology finally catches up to the questions that have waited decades for answers. There is something powerful about the act of naming, something that goes beyond the practical utility of identification. To name someone is to acknowledge their existence, to insist that they mattered, to refuse to let them disappear into the anonymity of history. For 65 years, the boy in the box had no name, and in that namelessness, there was a kind of second death, an erasure that compounded the tragedy of his murder. Now that erasure has been undone. Joseph Augustus Zarelli existed. He was real. He was a child who deserved to be loved and protected. And though the world failed him in the worst possible way, it has not forgotten him. It will not forget him. The story of Joseph Zarelli is, in some ways, a story about what we owe to the dead. We owe them memory. We owe them acknowledgement. We owe them the truth, or as much of the truth as we can uncover. The investigators who worked on this case for 65 years understood this instinctively. They were not seeking glory or recognition. Most of them worked on the case long after their official involvement had ended, on their own time, at their own expense. They did it because they believed that even a dead child, even a murdered child whom no one had claimed, deserved to have someone fighting for him. There is a lesson in their persistence for all of us. In a world that moves quickly, that forgets easily, that treats yesterday's tragedy as yesterday's news, these investigators refused to move on. They held on to the boy in the box for decades, carried him with them through the years, made him part of their lives, even though they had never known him in life. They treated his case not as a job but as a calling, a moral obligation that could not be set aside simply because the trail had gone cold or the leads had dried up. The same spirit animated the strangers who visited his grave year after year, leaving flowers and toys for a child they had never met. It animated the cemetery workers who tended his plot with particular care, making sure that America's unknown child was not forgotten even by those whose job it was to maintain the grounds. It animated the journalists who returned to the story again and again, keeping it in the public eye, refusing to let it fade from memory. All of these people, in their various ways, were asserting that Joseph Zarelli mattered, that his life had value, that his death was a tragedy that deserved to be remembered and, if possible, avenged. This is the work of civilization, when you think about it. Not the building of monuments or the winning of wars, but the quieter work of remembering, of insisting that every human life has dignity, of refusing to accept that children can be murdered and forgotten. The investigators and citizens who kept the boy in the box alive in memory for 65 years were doing this work, whether they thought of it in those terms or not. They were standing against the darkness that tried to swallow Joseph Zarelli, the darkness of anonymity and indifference and forgetting. And in the end, improbably, impossibly, they won. The darkness did not prevail. Joseph Augustus Zarelli has a name, and that name will be remembered. If there is a case you believe deserves to be told, a story of someone forgotten who deserves to be remembered, you can share it. These stories matter. The telling of them is one small way we insist that every life has value, that no one should vanish from the world without someone noticing, without someone caring enough to ask who they were and what happened to them. The investigators who worked on the boy in the box for 65 years understood this instinctively. They could not save Joseph Zarelli. They could not bring him back or undo the violence that was done to him. But they could refuse to let him be forgotten. And in that refusal there was a kind of love, a determination to honor a child who had been dishonored in every way imaginable. Joseph Zarelli was 4 years old when he died. He weighed 30 pounds. He had light brown hair and surgical scars on his body, and bruises that spoke of suffering beyond what any child should endure. He was beaten to death and discarded like garbage in the woods outside Philadelphia, and no one came forward to claim him for 65 years. But he is not forgotten. He has a name now, and that name will endure long after everyone who worked on his case has joined him in the grave. America's unknown child is unknown no more.